just starting out. So we're also looking for volunteers to organize next year's seminar series. So if you're interested, please contact either myself or Dr. Natalia Mota as well. Okay. And just so you know, before I introduce our very, very lovely speakers who volunteered for today, just a bit of a seminar structure. So we've got 2 speakers today. Each one will speak for about 20 to 25 minutes. 5 minutes of discussion of each talk by the other speaker, and then after that, we'll do the open Q&A that we do all the time. And use the chat box to put your questions online, or raise your hand, and then we can get you to ask your question during the Q&A as well. Okay, so it's a great pleasure to announce our first speaker. Megan Boudewyn is an assistant professor of psychology at the University of California, Santa Cruz, and she received her PhD from UC Davis. So after completing her postdoctoral work in translational cognitive neuroscience at UC Davis, she worked as a project scientist at the UC Davis Medical Center in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences before joining faculty at UC Santa Cruz. Just a little bit of a background on Megan's work. She focuses primarily on cognitive neuroscience, primary research interests in language processing and comprehension. And our second speaker is Philip Sumner, who received his PhD from Sumner University in 2019, currently postdoctoral research fellow at the Cognitive Neuropsychiatry Lab at Swinburne as well in Melbourne, Australia. And his research interests are studying cognitive neurobiological mechanisms of formal thought disorder, as well as its phenomenology. Current projects focusing on auditory verbal hallucinations and schizotypy, but also on the collection of speech within schizophrenia and major depression. So I think that's enough from me. And if Megan, if you're ready to get started.
Sure. Let me share my screen. All right, so I think you all should be able to see that.
Yep.
All right, cool.
So it's a little blurry, but.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Hopefully that is I'm not sure why it would be blurry.
That's all right.
Is it okay enough to see?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
All right, over to you.
All right, great. So I'll just kind of start out with some stuff that I guess we probably already all know, which is that, schizophrenia is a disorder characterized by psychotic symptoms and cognitive deficits. And I've been kind of working a lot at the intersection of language and what are, often talked about as domain general deficits. So like working memory and cognitive control, which have been, impairments in those sort of domain general areas have been really reliably observed in patients with schizophrenia across a really wide variety of tasks and may lead to impaired language processing. So I've got this very low-tech little Venn diagram just kind of pointing out that, language does rely on these domain general processes. And so with that and, keeping time in mind, today, I'll just kind of turn to the big picture question I'm going to be talking about, which is how do changing demands of language engage the working memory system in general, but how does this impact language processing during comprehension for patients with schizophrenia? So language comprehension, of course, requires that we keep and use mental representations of context and what we've heard or read before in mind over time to use as we, keep receiving language input. And so, in other words, language relies on working memory. So to investigate this question, I typically use electrophysiology, and since today for the seminar, we're really focusing on how to measure the timing of language, I'll just take a brief moment to point out some things. This is actually my daughter wearing an EEG cap, and she's pointing at her EEG scrolling by. So this is just a little snippet of the raw data. Each one of these lines represents a signal coming from one of the electrodes that's attached right now. And the main thing I want to point out is the timing precision. So hopefully it's not too blurry and you can actually see this little green line here. And this corresponds to an event marker. So in this case, it's the onset of a particular sentence. So if you were listening to a whole story, I could mark exactly where each sentence started or each word within a sentence started. And then you can look with really fine-grained timing precision at the EEG activity that's happening right at that moment, which is really great for studying language, which, as we know, unfolds really rapidly. And so you can kind of track EEG as someone is listening to a story or a set of stories. So to return to this question of how to study working memory engagement, I want to take a super brief detour, just this one slide, into non-language neuroscience and think a little bit about what we know about the neural mechanisms of working memory. And this is some recordings. This is an old paper from 1971. Some recordings of prefrontal neural populations in non-human primates, where you observe sustained neural activity in response to maintaining a stimulus as an internal representation. So if you see a cue of some sort, like a picture or an object, and then it's taken away, but you need to keep that in mind, or the monkey needs to keep it in mind in order to make a response. This is then maybe their response. In the interim, these are basically populations of prefrontal neurons firing. And so the idea would be that perhaps this sustained signal is mapping on to, or is a candidate mechanism for how we are keeping mental representations in mind. So to pull that into some human work with EEG, if you look at very similar paradigms where you get, these are non-language tasks. So if you get like a, display of colorful squares, the display is then removed. You have to sort of maintain that internally, keep that in working memory over time, and then you're going to get presented with again. If you look at this retention interval, when nothing is actually on the screen and you're just keeping those squares in mind, and you time lock the signal, so this marker here is when this memory array left the screen, you actually get this increase, this really slow increase in negative, it's called a negative slow wave, in response to the size of the working memory load. So if you had to remember, one colorful square versus 2 versus 3 versus 4, it increases as the load increases. So really, I bring this up, and I'm going to turn to language now on the next slide. I really bring this up just to make the point that the size of these waves is reflecting your brain holding stuff in working memory. And let's try to now map that on to what we're doing with language comprehension. So if negative slow waves are a neural marker of working memory representations over a delay, what I've been wondering about is if you can observe them during language comprehension. So if you think about that delay period where you had a display of colorful squares and then they went away and you had to maintain that in mind over time, you might think about the pause between sentences in natural speech. So if you are listening to a conversation, you get sentence 1, there's typically a pause, maybe 1,000 milliseconds, a second, and then you get the next sentence. That is really similar to the delay period in those working memory tasks. And so the question might be, if you think about sentence characteristics as stuff that you need to maintain in working memory, you might expect that you could see very similar effects in the pause between sentences as a function of the difficulty or ease of kind of maintaining previous context in mind. So how to manipulate working memory load in a natural language context? There's lots of different ways. So if you are, again, looking at just squares, more squares is a higher load, fewer squares is a less demanding working memory load. In language, you can think about things like the duration, like how long of a sentence are we talking about before that you have to kind of keep in mind. Is it particularly predictable, or is it predictive of a specific word? Like if a sentence leads you to kind of have in mind an expectation of what's coming next, you might think that that's something that can be maintained in working memory. If it's readable or not, like a very difficult versus a very easy sentence, or low level factors like word frequency. So a sentence full of really common high frequency words versus full of very rare low frequency words. And so what we're going to do is look at sentence one characteristics on all of these sentence one characteristics, and then look at how they influence activity during the pause before you get the next sentence. So here is our design. So when you're going to see a bunch of figures, and hopefully you can see this okay. Okay. So the sentence one offset is the time lock point to these. Okay, so prior to this line over here in the baseline period is when the person was actually listening to sentence one. This is actually the pause before they get another sentence. And so then the prediction would be long sentence one durations might be more demanding of working memory resources than short duration sentences. Sentences leading to the prediction of a specific word might be more demanding than sentences that were not predictive. And so it's important to think about not necessarily the sentence itself is predictable, but that something coming up will be predictable because of that sentence. So you're like generating a prediction and you haven't gotten that predictable word yet. A difficult to read sentence might be more demanding than an easy to read sentence. And a sentence containing less common words might be more demanding than a sentence containing more frequent words. So overall, the idea is greater demands. You should see a larger NSW stands for negative slow wave, negatives plotted up. So very similar to the working memory paradigm, you might see an increase here. So we first ran this study with healthy adults. So this is data from 30 participants. And so down at the bottom are the effects. And these plots look very, very similar to non-language tasks. So sentence one is back here in the baseline. For duration, you get an increased negativity for when you had just heard a long sentence compared to a short sentence, the idea being that there's a working memory load there that's different between those two conditions. Same thing for predictive sentences. So this is you've generated a specific prediction for a particular upcoming word versus not. Readability. This is calculated using, it's called the Gunning Fog Index, which is actually used to categorize newspaper articles often in terms of like their reading level. So a very readable sentence might be like 4th grade level. A less readable sentence might be like 12th grade level, something like that. And then the only place you don't really get this is when we contrast the waveforms based on sentence one word frequency. And this may be the case that there weren't any extremely unusual words in this sample. So it may be the case that, had we really pushed the rare words, we may have seen a difference. But it may also be the case that a really low level factor like that is not contributing significantly to differences in working memory load. All right. So I want to have a look at this pattern when we test individuals with schizophrenia. So same task, listening to 2 sentence stories. Sentence 1 and sentence 2 are separated by a pause of a couple of seconds, not far off the pause of normal speech. And data collection is ongoing. So I have preliminary results here from 12 patients. And what you can see is a very similar effect of duration that we saw with healthy controls. So it's actually a larger effect than we saw with healthy controls. So you have negative plotted up here. Long sentences are showing the more negative effect. We are not seeing an effect of predictiveness in patients. And again, data collection is ongoing, so I don't want to make too much of this, but it is kind of interesting to think about that as possibly reflective of patients perhaps not generating predictions in the same way necessarily during comprehension that healthy controls do. So that'll be something to kind of keep an eye on. But you also see the same effect of readability here, where things that are more difficult, low readability, are showing the larger effect. And then same as with the controls, the patients also don't show the effect of word frequency. So this is kind of in line overall with this idea that this effect is reflecting a working memory load. So this suggests the fact that they're larger effects than with controls may suggest that this is akin to a, this is akin to a greater working memory load than in controls for the very same sentences. So this was an interesting pattern, and it suggests that, working memory load effect of sentence one context may be somewhat exaggerated in patients compared to controls, and that's why you get this difference. But there's an additional element to this story that I haven't brought up yet, and that is that the clinical sample data I just showed you was actually 1/2 of an experiment in which patients actually received transcranial direct current stimulation before their EEG session. So what you just saw was the effects of healthy controls, at baseline after sham stimulation, where they have not received any kind of neurostimulation. And then the same thing for patients after sham placebo stimulation. So essentially the baseline effects. And so what I want to do is just really briefly introduce what transcranial direct current stimulation is, and then show you the results of what happens after that with this pattern. So TDCS is the acronym I'll use for this. And if you're not familiar with this, this is a non-invasive stimulation technique. The cap that you use to apply this stimulation looks just like an EEG cap. You put electrodes here and you pass a really weak current, so 1 to 2 milliamps, about the amount in like an LED battery across cortex, so from one electrode to another. And the goal of this is to induce an electric field that can very subtly modulate neural activity. So the idea would be if you were to use frontal electrodes, you could, for example, enhance neural activity in prefrontal cortex, which we think is related to working memory processing and ultimately language processing as well. So here's a diagram just kind of showing how this works. This is a bird's eye view looking down and a simulation of if you pass current from this particular electrode F3 to this one FP2. This is sort of the location of where you would induce an electric field. It's pretty diffuse. It's not super targeted to a particular area. So it's sort of general prefrontal stimulation as compared to sham stimulation, which is when you put on the cap briefly ramps up to the same amount of current as in the true stimulation condition, but then ramps right down. And the purpose of that is so participants are blinded as to which condition they're in. So our hypothesis is that to the extent that you're able to engage prefrontal circuits that are involved in things like maintaining information over time, internal working memory representations, we should perhaps then see an effect in a domain like language comprehension, at least when you're looking at these working memory related language effects, like holding context in mind across the pause in a story, for example. So here are those results. On the top is actually the data you've already seen. So this was the sham condition, just the placebo. There's not actually any stimulation being received. And so you have that similar effect, but exaggerated effect of sensitivity to sentence one duration and readability. And what you can see on the bottom, this is after stimulation. The effects are actually reduced significantly, and these look a lot more similar to the control. So you can see this a bit more clearly. I'm going to show you a difference waveform to isolate this effect of TDCS, where I take the stim condition and subtract the sham. So that's shown here. So this is long duration minus short conditions, and then stimulation minus sham. And so what you can see is the sham condition has the much larger effect. So it's more negative here, which is sort of that working memory load effect. So the idea would be at baseline, patients with schizophrenia are showing an exaggerated sensitivity to working memory demands compared to controls. But after prefrontal stimulation, that is being reduced and looking a lot more like the control group. And you see that same pattern here with the readability contrast, where so this is more difficult minus more easy. And so what you see here again is at baseline, you get that exaggerated effect, and then it's reduced after stimulation. So overall, this pattern of results suggests that the neural markers of working memory demands are influenced by sentence context characteristics. And these results are consistent with this idea that negative slow waves, so this lingering negativity that we think has a lot to do with maintaining internal representations over time. It's consistent with this idea that these discourse context representations are held in mind as additional language input is received during comprehension, both in healthy adults and in schizophrenia. But that patients with schizophrenia show this relatively exaggerated effect of working memory load during the pause between sentences as a function of what the characteristics of that sentence you just heard were. And following non-invasive prefrontal cortex stimulation, patients show comparable working memory effects during comprehension, as do healthy adults. And overall, I wanted to show you this data today, even though the sample size is relatively small, because I think it's really in keeping with this theme of temporal measurement. The design here was able to capitalize on the strengths of the timing precision of EEG to look at something that's happening really quickly during comprehension. So in natural connected speech is full of pauses between sentences. And the idea would be that your brain is actively maintaining that context as it has a brief moment before the next sentence, and that can be relatively demanding, or at least these results suggest that in patients versus controls. So I'll end there and turn it over to discussion.
Thanks, Megan. Yeah, I think we might hold questions till the Q&A after.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, Phil has spoken as well. So can I get you to thank you, Megan, first. that was really, really fascinating. I think TDCS I personally think is a really fascinating tool, and there's so many things I want to do with it. So I might want to have a chat with you soon. And Phil, do you want to share your slides? And so our second speaker, Dr. Philip Sumner, take it away.
Hi guys, can you hear me?
Yep.
You can see my slides?
Yep.
So thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk today about fMRI, and I've chosen to focus on formal thought disorder, the symptom in schizophrenia. My name is Philip, and I've completed my PhD with Professor Susan Rossell a couple of years ago now. I have to make a slight confession. I don't consider myself to be a great expert with functional neuroimaging, but I did spend a long period of time during my PhD reviewing the literature and thinking about the studies that had been conducted. And so I thought I would talk about the results of a systematic review I conducted, which was published a couple of years ago, 2018 now, I think. So I just quickly talk about what motivated me to do this, and then we'll go into the results, and then I'll try and sort of look at some of the issues that I identified, or sort of the shortcomings in the literature, and then maybe how recent works have started to address those issues. So probably won't be much of a surprise to people here that schizophrenia is considered to be heterogeneous almost across the board. And for a while, there's been people who, maybe a minority of people who maybe explored symptoms as a way of reducing some of that heterogeneity. And there's a couple of papers that influenced me specifically, but there are plenty of them out there now. Cohen and Doherty in 2005 presented a paper that showed how an analysis of symptoms could find correlations with cognitive or neuropsychological performance when a syndrome-based analysis couldn't, so positive and negative syndromes. So a little bit more sensitive maybe to finding mechanisms. And they're in formal thought disorder, which is primarily a symptom of disorganized or impoverished speech. And so it's the main language symptom in psychosis. And there's been people in the past who have showed that even within that symptom group, there are potentially divergent patterns of correlations with language processes and neuropsychology. I think Eric's done some work in this, and plenty of others. And so even within formal thought disorder, you can get divergent mechanisms potentially. And, you know, maybe a testament to discourse, at least from my perspective, there seems to have been a slight renewed interest in formal thought disorder. You can see that there's been actually almost a constellation of systematic reviews and meta-analyses that have come out recently. These are not all of them, but Wensing, myself, Gavelti, Kircher have all reviewed the neuroimaging correlates of formal thought disorder almost at the same time. But when I started my PhD, there was basically no one reviewing the neuroimaging correlates of formal thought disorder, even though the literature kind of started from the early 90s. So now my systematic review itself is a little bit old now. The literature search was up till the 2016, and I found 35 task-based functional neuroimaging studies. 29 of them were fMRI, and there were 6 PET studies, and they tended to be really old. Now, 20 of them were formal thought disorder motivated. That's a term I kind of settled on to describe studies that were set out specifically to look at formal thought disorder. Now, a lot of studies were focused on schizophrenia, diagnostic correlates, and as a secondary analysis would explore symptoms that correlated with any significant clusters that they'd found. So, and when you break this down roughly by the cognitive processes that were investigated using tasks in the fMRI, none of them were really investigating executive function. So some of the tasks did rely on executive functioning to some extent, but the contrasts were designed to sort of isolate semantic or language processes. So straight away, there was kind of a hole there for the executive hypothesis of formal thought disorder. And here's a snapshot of kind of the main regions that were implicated. So this lightest color here is studies that didn't find anything associated with formal thought disorder severity in terms of fMRI. So straight away, it looks as though even the most common correlates are, you know, almost 50-50. And a cynical person might suggest that the null findings are the most replicated out of these studies. However, it's not quite as simple as that, because I'll go into that in a moment, but the sensitivity of the analyses based on the measurement of formal thought disorder, as well as sample size and other things, mean that some of these studies didn't necessarily intend to find correlates specifically for formal thought disorder, and even if they did, there's a lot of error and a lot of a lack of power as well. So otherwise, the main correlates you can see: left superior temporal gyrus, as well as the right, and pretty much with all these correlates, they found both increased and decreased activation associated with the severity of formal thought disorder. And the meaning of that's kind of dependent on the tasks used and the contrasts. but the left and right superior temporal gyri, the middle temporal gyri, and to a smaller extent, the fusiform gyrus and parahippocampal gyrus. So these temporal regions were often found to be associated with formal thought disorder. In addition, there were cingulate cortex, so in the medial surface of the brain, particularly the anterior cingulate cortex, which I'll talk about shortly. And also left inferior frontal gyrus and right inferior frontal gyrus, as well as medial prefrontal cortex. And there's a few other sort of subcortical, as well as the insular subcortical correlates, including the cerebellum and the right caudate. So there were a few regions that did sort of show correlates with formal thought disorder across different studies and using different tasks. Now, I thought I'd present, if I have time, a couple of example studies that just sort of illustrate the methodology a little more. So Kircher et al. In 2001, they did an fMRI investigation of formal thought disorder, and they collected symptom capture sort of almost real time, with the caveats of the bold response delay. But they correlated the bold response directly with measures of formal thought disorder severity based on the TLI, and during free speech production. So they used ink blots to elicit speech. And it's an example where they found decreased bold response in the left superior temporal gyrus and the left posterior middle temporal gyrus with more severe formal thought disorder expressed at the time. There were also increased responses in the cerebellum and the right caudate and the right precentral gyrus. Now, this is just one of several studies that the Kircher's group investigated. And even though it's a small sample, they did collect people who were manifesting or expressing quite severe formal thought disorder, which is a kind of an issue with some other studies that have struggled to maybe sample severe formal thought disorder. And so that can also be a reason for some of the null findings. In this case, they had quite severe people with severe formal thought disorder. And they replicated some of these findings, so particularly the left superior temporal gyrus and the middle temporal gyrus that's been kind of reproduced. And a second study, this one's a little more semantic instead of language production. I just illustrated the task they used, the semantic object retrieval task, where they were presented pairs of words, and the words either describe features of an object, in this case, honey and stings describes a bee, or they didn't describe an object, they were features of different objects. And so the authors contrasted retrieval conditions with non-retrieval conditions. And they found basically that there were some anterior cingulate responses. The bold response for the anterior cingulate cortex was larger during the retrieval conditions than the non-retrieval conditions. And this was associated with the severity of formal thought disorder. And they also replicated that in 2013 using the same task. And what was interesting with that as well is incorrectly performed trials. So people with formal thought disorder tended to over-recall, so they'd retrieve semantic information incorrectly for trials that there shouldn't be a semantic retrieval, and that too was associated with cingulate activity. suggesting that these individuals with severe formal thought disorder were sort of recalling semantic information. And other tasks had used other semantic sort of tasks from other studies, so sentence completion, semantic congruence decisions. And when semantic retrieval was involved, they seemed to catch the anterior cingulate cortex. So I just went through a couple of example studies, but taken together, I found that the inferior frontal gyrus, the middle temporal gyrus, the anterior cingulate, and to some extent the posterior cingulate and the caudate nucleus, they were, reasonably consistently coming up as fMRI correlates of formal thought disorder. The superior temporal gyrus also was a functional correlate, but it was also a structural correlate, so that's why it's in green. These blue regions here, they showed structural relationships. And these regions in particular stand out as being traditional language regions, Wernicke's and Broca's areas. And it's been written about subsequently. Kircher in 2018 noted a glutamate hypothesis, how the synaptic density within the superior temporal gyrus might be reduced in people with schizophrenia and formal thought disorder. And there are signs from ketamine studies that people without mental health diagnoses, when they take ketamine, it can induce formal thought disorder-like experiences or symptoms. And that's a glutamate antagonist. So there's reason to think that there's some glutamate circuits that might be explaining some of the functional changes in the superior temporal gyrus and the connections to the inferior frontal and middle temporal. And but also maybe these regions have been implicated in resting state networks sort of more recently, and some of these regions correspond with the ventral attentional network, which is kind of a bottom-up exogenous attentional system. And there was some suggestion, for example, Lake, I think in 2008, emphasized how attention, the prioritization of information in selective attention might account for certain aspects of formal thought disorder, including those in mood disorders such as mania or bipolar disorder. And so there's an inappropriate sort of prioritization of irrelevant stimuli that can pervade into conversation and be expressed as distractible speech or maybe loss of goal. And some of the circuitry, the subcortical and the dopaminergic circuitry that you can see there in figure B, that also may be related to something along those lines where there's an inappropriate salience ascribed to irrelevant stimuli. So there's quite a lot of hypotheses that might be driven and based also on pretty well-known literature in schizophrenia more broadly. Now, some of the shortcomings, so sample size, the median sample size of these studies was 13. So that's the clinical sample. So they were quite small, which obviously means that there's a power issue potentially. especially if they did whole brain analyses and had to correct for multiple comparisons over the entire brain. And that's compounded with general symptom studies where they had to also correct for multiple comparisons within various psychosis symptoms. So they might also explore hallucinations or delusions or other symptom severities. And there are relatively few thought disorder motivated studies that specifically set out in their aims to explore formal thought disorder and the correlates in fMRI. Negative formal thought disorder is also somewhat underrepresented in the literature. Most analyses are either global, so including negative and positive, or they're just positive. And they don't look at dimensions beyond that as well. So there is factor analysis evidence indicating that there's multiple dimensions represented in this informal thought disorder, maybe 3 factors, and almost none of the studies create scores based on this literature. I think I mentioned this one, the range of severity sampled is also an issue. So it's quite common for studies to have mostly people without formal thought disorder and a few with mild, a few with moderate, and it's pretty rare to see severe. And then that affects their findings too. And the measurement of formal thought disorder. So single item measures from the PANS, for example, are not necessarily as sensitive as the TLC or the TLI, which are specifically designed to capture different formal thought disorder symptoms and will more likely capture the different dimensions represented in formal thought disorder. And so these sort of indicate that there's a lack of sensitivity generally with these studies, and that probably accounts for at least some of the null findings that I mentioned earlier. And lastly, with this greater reductionism that I've kind of argued for, increasing sensitivity, there is also the reverse issue of specificity. So any findings that relate to formal thought disorder, are they specific to formal thought disorder, or do they represent schizophrenia or a syndrome more globally? And that's sometimes hard to tease apart with a single study. But I think at least some of the evidence is suggestive of specific relationships with the severity of formal thought disorder. And this is sort of how I went about assessing the quality of each study in terms of the measurement of formal thought disorder. So it's things like, did it as a bare minimum, did they look at the positive and negative formal thought disorder separately? Did they use a multiple item measure, or was it limited to a single item? And did they measure, did their analysis account for different dimensions? Did they use standardized methods to elicit speech, which can be important for the reliability of severity ratings? And did they report the severities of formal thought disorder sampled? So there's, studies varied a lot in terms of these criteria, but what was interesting was even though sample size didn't seem to differ between studies that didn't find significant findings and studies that did, but the amount of criteria met by studies that reported significant findings tended to be, they met, the median was 3 criteria out of the 5, whereas studies that didn't find significant results tended to only meet 1 of those criteria. And it's roughly similar for each of the regions that were implicated. So just very quickly, just to sort of talk about what's happened since, because it's a little while now since these correlates of these functional neuroimaging studies were reviewed. There's been studies recently that have sort of addressed some of these shortcomings. So, for example, in 2020, there was a study using the NBAT task to look at executive functioning, so working memory and attention. They had 70 people with schizophrenia and used TLC dimensions. So they analyzed a disorganization dimension based on the factor analysis literature, and also a negative dimension, and global as well. And they found that the fluent disorganization wasn't linked to the severity, wasn't linked to any of their fMRI contrasts. However, allergia and global formal thought disorder were linked to bilateral dorsolateral prefrontal activation, as well as inferior frontal and basal ganglia. So this study used a larger sample and showed relationships with negative formal thought disorder in executive functioning. So it's definitely sitting in a gap in the literature. And there have been other studies, but I thought I'd throw in one more example study from Chen et al. In 2021, a multi-site fMRI study. And this was based on Sing's meta-analysis. They used their findings from that to look at functional connectivity from 3 regions: the left superior temporal gyrus, and the left dorsal posterior middle temporal gyrus, and the ventral posterior middle temporal gyrus. And they did use the PANS, and they looked at negative and positive thought disorder separately as well as globally. And they had a large sample of 121 participants with schizophrenia, and there was a second a validation sample of 34. And they had quite a complicated validation procedure, but they did find resting state functional connectivity correlates with positive formal thought disorder, not with negative formal thought disorder. And so left superior temporal gyrus showed functional connectivity with the right dorsolateral prefrontal region, mainly the middle frontal gyrus, and slightly less reliably, but with the inferior temporal cortex and the supramaginal gyrus. The dorsal posterior middle temporal gyrus showed connectivity with the right middle temporal gyrus, so left to right. And reduced connectivity was reported from the ventral posterior middle temporal gyrus and the right inferior parietal lobule. So again, another study showing this time resting state functional connectivity, which is something I've not touched on too much, but in a larger sample across different sites. So I've run out of time, but hopefully I've showed that there's pretty reliable now evidence showing the temporal and frontal correlates of formal thought disorder. And this is task-based with semantic and language tasks, and now being shown with resting state. And they've also, we're starting to move into looking at negative formal thought disorder in larger samples, and more robust methods. So thank you for that.
Thanks, Phil. Thanks for the review. Thanks for also the update about things that have been happening since your review came out. So I'd like to now open up to Q&A, but we'll have Megan and Phil kick us off, shall we?
Sure. Thanks. It was an interesting overview. So yeah, I mean, I guess one question I have is sort of thinking about the frontotemporal network that's kind of popping up as related. I guess I'm wondering what you think about like if pieces of that are sort of driving formal thought disorder versus like a reflection of a consequence. So to say the question in another way, like some of the more executive control pieces of that, like the ACC or some of the like DLPFC regions, I could imagine a story where like that is maybe the core of what's going on, and then you're seeing like trickle down effects in other areas. And I'm just curious if there's any data that kind of speaks to that, either methodologically or with a task. Or
I think at this stage, from my knowledge in the fMRI literature, it's not clear. But looking back at some of the older language production models, I think the most likely candidates were in of deficits in terms of language processes were in lexicosemantic retrieval, which was often ascribed to those superior temporal and inferior frontal cortices, but also monitoring processes. So early on in the language production stage and later on in the language production stage. And so, yeah, they were kind of hypothesized, I suppose, with some evidence to be where we would look for maybe mechanisms of formal thought disorder. But it's hard to sort of judge causality with sort of these studies. They're more correlational, I guess.
if you could like fund a study on, you know, neuroimaging with discourse level processing in formal thought disorder, I mean, would there be like a sub-region that you feel like was kind of undersampled in the available data, or like a particular set of paradigms where you were like, oh, if there were only a few more studies in this area?
I think the first thing would be, you know, larger samples with consistent paradigms. You know, looking at the literature, it's over a span of 25 years, maybe close to 30 years now. But there's so many tasks and just these pockets of localized differences. So they're hard to make sense of. And then on the other hand, you've got, you know, resting state networks and schizophrenia level correlates, which are, you know, they may or may not implicate formal thought disorder as a phenomenon. So I think being consistent with paradigms in large samples to sort of get a sense for just how reproducible are these findings. I think that's that, like I've mentioned at the end there, it is starting to happen. And then maybe it's more the tasks. So something that could tap into maybe ventral attention. I think that might be something that we haven't looked at. So like exogenous bottom-up driven attention, and whether that sort of maybe akin to what you're doing with maybe loss of goal, which has a clear implication, you know, in formal thought disorder, and whether this bottom-up processes can sort of drive the topic of conversation, or you know, something like that. So, and of course, language-based or objective, you know, measures of formal thought disorder and related processes, which obviously discourse has started with the speech protocols. That's a great step too, to increase sensitivity of the analyses and yeah, the dimensions looked at.
Cool. Do we have any questions from the floor? Well, I've got a question. Actually, I was going to use that same point Phil just raised about bottom-up processes, Megan, to you, because, you know, you talked about, you know, just using EEG, that temporal sensitivity, which I think is really quite fascinating. What would be the things that you want to look for in an ideal project?
I mean, it's a good question, a hard question.
I know.
Yeah. I mean, I think with EEG studies, both in schizophrenia and in healthy adults, there's not as much connected discourse, or even in the stuff that I showed you, it's a discourse paradigm because they're two sentences connected, but that's still pretty far away from natural discourse paradigms. And I think I've dabbled in just collecting a little bit of data on like story length, true discourse comprehension, where you're listening for 20 minutes, like in a lecture, like you would be in a lecture, or you're reading for the same story as opposed to disconnected sentences. And I just think it'd be interesting to really pursue it, because it is a rich language, is so rich with things that you can kind of look at. Or I mean, even if you're looking at like the pauses between sentences and connected discourse, and how context builds over time, or if you're looking at things like new concepts being introduced as discourse progresses, and then reference being established with stuff you listened to or heard before or read before. I don't know, I'd like to see that, just more true discourse processing, which I'm totally guilty of myself, having these like super small little, two sentences that are connected. But I just think it'd be really great to expand that out a little bit, because it's a really rich data set if you do.
Yeah, no, I totally get that. But I think we do all we can at the moment. Lena?
Yeah.
Thanks, Eric. Thank you very much, Megan and Philip. This was fantastic coverage of physiology, neurophysiology in two different aspects, EEG as well as fMRI. And thanks for putting together the discussion as well. And I had a specific question for you, Megan. I quite like the idea that working memory load, the neural inefficiency that you see with increasing working memory load is very similar to the inefficiency you see with complex language processing in psychosis. In working memory tasks, at least from the literature we know so far, there seems to be an inverted U-shaped inefficiency with load having at least in healthy people, there seems to be an inverted U-shaped inefficiency in the processing. Do we see a similar effect in language as well in healthy people or in patients?
It's a really good question. So I would imagine so. I don't have data to speak to it, but at least the only data I have that could maybe start to get at this question is some data looking at fluctuations in attention during these tasks as well. So with the idea that if what's causing, or at least part of what's causing that U-shaped performance pattern, where like you have kind of a sweet spot of like a working memory load, but if the load exceeds some threshold, you kind of lose the thread entirely, and that kind of thing. If that's the case, you might see like attention lapsing happening as well. So I have a little bit of data looking at if you like interrupt people during these tasks and ask them, right before I interrupted you, were you on task or off task? We see higher rates of off-task responding in patients with schizophrenia, and it's correlated with their working memory performance really strongly as well. So I think there might be something there to that pattern, but at least in this case, this was the data I showed was kind of like a split down the middle, difficult versus easy. So I didn't have that like gradation of load, but yeah, I would imagine it would be there.
Excellent. Just to follow up on that, Megan, this is great. In fact, maybe this question is an expression of my greed to have more data from what you just showed. But you did show that TDCS to prefrontal cortex, at least in language comprehension, seems to improve the processing to an extent that is similar to healthy people in the 12 subjects that you studied. What happens to production? Does it improve? Do you have any data on language production?
I don't. I wish I did. Yeah, I mean, it'd be a really interesting question. I think it'd be technically challenging to do. But yeah, this is all at the comprehension level. So something for future studies.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Do we have any other questions from the group? I was gonna actually follow up that point actually, because a few years ago now, did a bit of work because I did a lot of comprehension, sentence comprehension and homophone comprehension in my PhD work, and then of course made that whole argument that production is linked to comprehension, and how could we go there? And the form of thought disorder scales are perhaps a bit cruder measure of production. And until we get all our discourse speech data together. I was going to say, so because you talked about this interruption aspect, so interruptions in comprehension or interruptions in production, do you expect to see any differences in the responses from participants in either of these cases?
Yeah, that's a really good. I haven't looked at in production, but I mean, so yeah, so in the context of comprehension, this would be like, you're listening to a story over headphones, and then suddenly the story stops and you get this question asked instead, and then you have to answer it before you can continue. And the goal of that there is to kind of try to get a baseline estimate of, assuming we occasionally catch you in a mind-wandering state, we can maybe start to estimate how often that's occurring, in different groups. With production, yeah, I would guess it possibly would be different, but I don't know of a lot of data that has done that paradigm. But yeah, no, I think it's a really interesting question. I have to kind of think about how you would probe that, and if it would tap into kind of a different mechanism, like assuming that you've kind of got your what you're about to produce is ready to go, and then you receive a question. It might kind of interrupt things at a different stage, maybe, and you would get a different pattern. But yeah, I haven't looked at that. Interesting too.
Yeah, because I think we pull in a few more things at the higher level, so more of your other executive functions, and more like just overall monitoring, maybe some of the feedback loops, something to that effect.
Yeah, and I think you'd get fewer like zone out states overall, but you might be susceptible still to distraction, like hearing something or somebody saying something, that kind of thing. You get kind of maybe a different pattern of attention differences.
Yeah. Cool. Brian?
Yeah, this is a sort of dumb question. I'm sorry, I might have missed this. What was the task in these? Was it just passive listening, or what were they trying to achieve again?
Yeah, so they're a subset of the stories had a true or false question. And I'm sorry, I think I went right over that. So
I missed it. Sorry.
Yeah, no. I mean, I think I didn't mention that part. So apologies.
Oh, well, that really. Okay.
Yeah. So it was just listening, and then on a subset of them, you had a simple true or false. Like if it was about a birthday party, the true or false was just intended to capture that they were generally paying attention. It'd be easy.
Yeah, I think that it's a totally different cup of tea. No, it's fine, and I think that makes sense for the results you have. But trying to extend that to normal conversation is a pretty big jump, where you don't have a test afterwards, and actually where I think the gaps between utterances are places where you probably pay the least attention. Yeah, no, but I mean, it's fine for the task. So basically, they are really forced to listen to everything. And so they have these gaps, and they can do rehearsal during them, basically.
Well, I think, yeah, so you are forced to listen to everything, but the gaps are only 2 seconds long. So they're pretty short for conscious retrieval, or for conscious rehearsal.
For rehearsal. For
rehearsal. I would imagine it.
You think that's short for the crucial part of the rehearsal? I don't know.
I mean, I guess it'd be interesting to kind of to change that duration a little bit, but definitely for some of the, like, because they're full length sentences, I don't know that it'd be enough time to really rehearse the way you could maybe do it in like a word list type of thing.
No, of course not. But quickly. Yeah. Okay. Well, lots to study.
Yeah.
I think it's quite fascinating. I mean, the very like methodological nerd in me wants to like gradually increase the time differences and see what happens.
Yeah.
But it sort of brings to mind and the terminology escapes me at the moment, but Chomsky had this really old argument about, someone's actual capacity to do something and their actual performance. and the terms he used escape my memory at the moment.
Confidence and performance, yeah.
That's it. And how do you think this would sit between that, and how much of it is, I know because you did healthy controls, and so we expect that there wouldn't be a lot of things that might actually affect, well, there will be things, but maybe not at the level of, let's say, patients. But how do you think that sits within this framework?
Of like how, like the extent to which something like a neural measure of working memory maintenance might map on to like recall later, that kind of thing.
Yeah, sorry, big philosophical question.
No, I'm trying to think of how to get there with the data. I mean, I think one thing I'm kind of curious about that maybe gets at this a little bit is, so as you kind of point out, this is a really big jump from like a long like an actual naturalistic conversation, but a even bigger jump would be if they were not like two sentence story context, but they were just unrelated completely, and you don't have that, there's really no motivation to keep in mind what you just heard, because over the course of like in a typical psycholinguistic sentence processing experiment, it's just sentences jumbled up that have no relation to each other. So that's actually a follow-up I'm running right now to see if you were just in healthy controls, if you were to take these same stimuli and just shuffle them so that they were no longer connected and look at the pause, do you still see any evidence of working memory maintenance? Because and the reason I was thinking it maybe gets at that question a little bit is thinking about like motivate, like what your goal is. Like if your goal of listening can no longer be to, put together this discourse representation, because that's not the input that you're receiving. Do you necessarily like hang on to that context in the same way? And I'm hypothesizing you don't, but I'm curious to see what happens on that.
Yeah. Did we have any other questions? Later.
Yeah, the answer that you just gave made me think, Megan. Comparing spoken language with writing is a bit of a challenge. If you presented, I think one of the things you presented was Gunning Fog Index, which is often used to see how good newspaper cuttings are in readability. And I wonder how much that relates to spoken discourse. In spoken discourse, we often use our fingers, 1 point, 1 point, 2.3, we kind of make gestures to reduce the load on working memory, load on cognitive processing. Has there been studies looking at correspondence between gunning fog in spoken language versus this kind of single sentence processing? Do you know any, can we draw inferences between the two?
I don't know of that many other examples of using gunning fog with auditory processing. Like you say, it's really meant for, or intended and developed for written passages. I used it here just because I was kind of trying to think about, if we think of sentence context as a working memory load, language is just full of so many other cues beside, like compared to something like a display of colorful squares, and you could slice it so many different ways. And so that was my attempt at like a very general easy versus difficult. I actually coded those sentences in different ways with different indices, and they were really, really correlated with each other. But yeah, it's not the most common measure in auditory processing, but you could substitute it. Like you could, I also had the same plot with like number of multi-syllable words per sentence, and that's like difficult versus number, shorter words, or like syntactic complexity. And it kind of came out the same way, if that's helpful.
Yeah,
sure.
There's a question in the chat for you, Phil. What do you think about automated measures of FTD, like your NLP models, with the connectivity scores and all that? And how do you think these scores might be beneficial for imaging studies on FTD, to add to the existing rating scales that are already there?
I think they're really useful. From that reductionist perspective that I've sort of been motivated by, it's more closely coupled to a single phenomenon, I guess. It's also, more quantitative. So traditional ratings are ordinal. Often, there's statistical things there. So just from a statistics perspective and a reductionist perspective, it's potentially much more sensitive. But the flip side is that you're looking at something so specific that maybe it doesn't have much in the way of for example, the correlates with prognosis or quality of life functioning and things like that. Maybe much more reduced, maybe not. I don't know. So I think from looking at mechanisms, I think it's a really good thing. But then asking what those mechanisms mean in terms of the person's kind of clinical picture or functioning, it might be less relevant. So I think you have to keep both in mind. The TLC, for example, you're getting a sense from the interviewer of how they're performing in conversation. Whereas some of the more specific language-based measures, automated measures, you might be looking at something a bit more focused in. But like I said, I think it's a really good idea.
I think probably a follow-up to that, then, what kinds of differences would you expect, between, let's say, something like latent semantic analysis, which is looking more at meaning and all of that, versus something like Natalia's speech graphs, where, you're just looking at the connectivity between the actual words in the sentence and in the speech string. What differences do you expect to see in that?
It's difficult. I'm not massively knowledgeable with some of the techniques, and in the more traditional scales, things like incoherence, they tend to be quite rare in the extreme. There's a really severe formal thought disorder. So it's sort of difficult, but I imagine the semantic retrieval, so how closely connected semantically word use is, in my head, that sort of is a good way of approaching some of the old semantic priming ideas with spreading of activation of semantic networks and things like that. And it's much more, focused in on that and testing that hypothesis than a TLC global would be potentially. So, and it might overcome or at least complement priming studies that have had issues with, methodology and the interpretation. Yeah, I think I answered your question.
Yeah. All right, did we have Lena?
Just one of the questions that Megan asked, Philip, was if you have all the money, what kind of study would you do and what area would you focus on? I was thinking how understudied cerebellum is in this entire, formal thought disorder field. I think part of the reason, I think your meta-analysis as well, your systematic review as well, Philip, showed there was not much interest in cerebellum at the time. And it is the same. Part of that is EEG and psycholinguistics cannot access cerebellum as easily as other techniques. But even in fMRI and anatomical studies, people collect cerebellar data but don't look at it. It's interesting because some of these techniques like TDCS, TMS even, cerebellum seems to be very accessible for some of these neurostimulation procedures. Experimentally studying cerebellum is becoming more feasible now compared to what it was 20 years ago. Any thoughts on cerebellum's role in timing, sequencing, either of you? I would like to hear if there is something that cohesively we can put together as a theory of what cerebellum does into formal thought disorder.
For me, it's a difficult question. I agree with you entirely, but it's because it's so understudied, it's kind of hard to maybe understand where it would fit. I mean, clinically, you see, it does have a role in speech, no doubt about that. And I think there was an old hypothesis from memory, maybe Andreasen, who mentioned the cerebellum. So there's definitely a underappreciated region that needs more research, but I beyond that, I'm not sure.
Yeah, I echo that. I mean, it's just, you're right though. I mean, it is more accessible with something like TDCS or and yet it still is such a understudy. I mean, I think it'd be really interesting to look at that more with something like speech production, where, like, as you say, there is a role for it, but it's still just not fully known. Super interesting area.
Yeah, great. Well, thanks for those thoughts. You know, once we don't have a good anatomical model of formal thought disorder, and I think it's very tempting to search where search hasn't been conducted before, and see if it'll turn up with better relationships. But you know, both of the talks just underlines how much we don't know yet, and how much has been only a scratch of the surface so far. So thanks for putting that together. I really want to appreciate the correspondence between these two talks today. Thank you very much.
Yeah, no, so that's fantastic. So I think if you don't have any questions, it's a nice short one today. Just in general, thanking everyone for attending, and for those watching online, thanks for following along Discourse Seminar Series this year. We'll come back next year with a whole range of different talks, new speakers, more interesting things. Potentially for those who will be at SIRS next year, we'll see you there. But otherwise, just follow our updates on the website. I'd like to thank both our speakers again today. Very, very excellent talks. Recordings are available on YouTube as mentioned, and thanks everyone for coming.